All right, welcome back. We are so excited for our second panel for today. Once again, my name is Dr. Nika Molzek, and I am the creator and founder of Race Positive LLC, which is a consulting firm around helping people to talk about race in a way that's positive and engaging and actually productive. And today we'll be having our second panel, this time unpacking the history of the current criminal justice system, the campaign against police brutality, and what we can do to implement true reform. In 2020, I, along with I'm sure most of you, watched from our homes in quarantine, what was happening in many of the Black and Brown communities for years, or many people in those communities were fully aware of. And that is that justice in this country is not doled out equally. The defund the police hashtag became a call for racial justice activists to really draw attention to the criminal justice reform and the advocates for change, right, to the budgetary priorities that will be the focus for a little bit more of social services that are available to those communities. Sadly, however, opponents of reform engage in what I think is rightly described as disinformation campaigns that led to a huge misunderstanding of the initiative and much debate around it. Our conversation today will be about unpacking the history of our current criminal justice system and what we can do, like I said before, to implement reform using a racial justice framework. I would first like to introduce our distinguished featured speaker, Congressman Bobby Scott. Congressman Scott has represented Virginia's 3rd Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives since 1993. Previously, he served in Virginia's state legislature, where his legislative successes included increasing Virginia's minimum wage and improving healthcare benefits. Representative Scott is the first African American elected to Congress from Virginia since Reconstruction, which is a very long time. He currently serves as the chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor. He's also a leader on criminal justice reform, including co-authoring the recently enacted Safe, Accountable, Fair, and Effective Justice Act, widely recognized as one of the most comprehensive criminal justice reform bills ever. We're so pleased to welcome Congressman Scott.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank everyone for joining this webinar on racial justice. I'm pleased to join you today and note that we will hear from speakers on today's panel covering such important topics as reproductive justice, police accountability, the hidden bias in technology, and rebuilding our democracy. I don't have to remind anyone here that the pandemic has had a catastrophic impact on our society. Over 500,000 Americans have died, and we have record unemployment. This national crisis has laid bare the inequities in our country. Black and Hispanic populations are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 because they are more likely to be exposed to the virus due to inequities in terms of housing, transportation, occupation, and access to health care. And roughly 2 million women have left the workforce since 2019, in large part due to the pandemic. Thankfully, the Biden administration has prioritized ramping up vaccine distribution and has also unveiled a robust COVID-19 relief package, which will help our economy build back better. President Biden's relief package builds on the success of the CARES Act and the relief package that Congress passed at the end of last year. The pandemic has also placed a new focus on the importance of expanding health care. The Affordable Care Act has made affordable, comprehensive health care available to millions of Americans, and we must continue to build on that progress. The previous administration attempted to undermine that progress by attacking protections for contraceptive coverage and was a threat to the health and safety of women across the country. Additionally, some politicians have used freedom of religion as a tool to deny women access to health care. That is why I'm reintroducing the Do No Harm Act, which prevents the Religious Freedom Restoration Act from being misapplied to discriminate against individuals in the workplace, create barriers to contraception and abortion services, and treat members of the LGBTQ community unfairly. As chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, I'm also focused on boosting paychecks for working families. I was proud to introduce the Raise the Wage Act, which will gradually raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I'm also working to increase protections for pregnant workers. and also to address the achievement gap for students of color who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and school closures. The pandemic has made everything difficult in the last year, but it has also exposed systemic problems in policing in America. In the coming month, we will reintroduce the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This bill was the culmination of years of work by the Congressional Black Caucus and addresses issues of police brutality, racial profiling, and legal barriers to justice. The bill also is a response to the millions of people who have made their voices heard on the issue of policing in America. During the presidential campaign, President Biden made some very important promises about criminal justice reform. He recognizes that the tough on crime policies of the 1980s, which were driven by slogans like 3 strikes and you're out, or if you do the adult crime, you do the adult time, made us a leader in mass incarceration, but did nothing to reduce crime. It's time we followed the evidence and research and enacted laws that create proportional punishment and help people re-enter society, help them get a good job, help them treat their addiction, and help them get the mental health care they need. That's why I'm reintroducing the Safe Justice Act. The Safe Justice Act is a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill aimed at reforming federal sentencing, curtailing overcriminalization, and reducing recidivism. The bill will reduce crime, save money, and provide reinvestment into communities devastated by mass incarceration. We are at a critical point in our society. We can create a country that is based on principles of freedom, fairness, and justice. But to achieve this goal, we must secure quality health care, economic security, and civil rights for all. To enact these principles into law, we must learn the lessons from the 2020 presidential election, and that is that elections matter. Voting matters. Electing qualified leaders who follow facts and evidence is what helped this country get through this toughest times. Vigilance and a commitment to peaceful political action is required to combat the lies and racial hatred that threaten our democracy. And I hope you will learn from the panelists today, but most of all, I hope you will feel empowered to take up the cause of racial justice and create a more just and equitable society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman Bobby Scott. We're so grateful for your words. Now, I'd like to turn to our panelists and introduce the amazing group that I have for you today. The first person I want to introduce you to is Sakira Cook. Sakira is the director of the Justice Reform Program of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. The Leadership Conference is a coalition of more than 200 national organizations to promote and protect civil and human rights. Ms. Cook leads the development of the justice reform programs to advance transformative policy solutions that eliminate structural inequity, racism, and injustice at every stage of the criminal legal system. Welcome, Sakira. Our second person is Stephanie Morales. In 2015, Stephanie became the first woman to be elected Commonwealth's attorney in Portsmouth, Virginia. She is committed to seeking restorative justice and correcting the wrongs to members of the community by the system. In 2015, she established the Control-Alt-Delete program to foster successful re-entry for the formerly incarcerated community, also known as returning citizens. Morales is an author with a new children's book called The Day I Became a Lawyer. Welcome to our panel, Stephanie.
Thank you.
And the third person we want to welcome is Hassan Ahmad. Hassan is the founder and principal of the HMA law firm. He built the firm on one simple idea: people need protection and perseverance to prosper. Under Hassan's leadership, legal knowledge and skill is leveraged to fight for clients' rights. Hassan is fluent or proficient in 8 languages, which is amazing, besides English, and has earned a reputation among his peers as the go-to attorney in matters of immigration law. He's also an immigrant right advocate. Welcome, Hassan. Thank you so much for being with all of us. Hopefully, Stephanie will be able to hop on and chat with us soon. But my first question goes to Sakira, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I hope it's not Sakira and I'm butchering it.
It's
It is, yay, wonderful. So, of course, at the front of all of our minds in these conversations are the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all Elijah McClain. There's so many, unfortunately, within the Black community, and the mass movement for Black lives that has followed in the wake of these murders. What impact do you feel like this movement has had, and what progress, if any, do you feel has been made in the last 9 months?
So first I want to say thank you to the National Organization for Women for hosting this important conversation and inviting me here to speak to all of you. As was noted, I lead the Justice program at the Leadership Conference, and our coalition has been working on issues at the intersection of race and the criminal legal system for decades. And it is no surprise, I would say, that in the recent years, recent months also, we experience kind of an inflection point with the murders of a number of individuals, but I think the sort of spark was the murder of George Floyd, and the fact that it was captured on camera, and that it was so long that, he was being tortured with a knee to his neck by the police officer. And the nation was taken by storm. A series of protests throughout the summer and into the fall ensued. And what folks were, I think, calling our attention to, which has been the case for very, very long, is the fact that we actually have never reckoned with our history in this country. The history of enslavement, Jim Crow segregation, convict leasing, the structural racism and inequity that has basically been part and parcel of every system in this country has come to light, not only through the pandemic and the inequities that we see in healthcare, education, economic opportunity, the criminal legal system, but also, sort of how that intersects with anti-Black racism in America and the history of anti-Black racism in America. And so what you saw people, this movement rallying, I think, and it was so different, and I think it felt very different for people because it was so intersectional, it was so intergenerational, it was very diverse. And I think that is significant because it shows to some extent an awakening of people's minds and hearts to the fact that Black Americans, for the most part, and also Latino Americans and other people of color, have for too long, sort of been discriminated against and been subjugated in this country because of the presence of white supremacy and white nationalism, and how that intersects with every system that we have today. And that awakening, I think, is moving people to take action and to think about these issues very differently. And so I think in the last 9 months, we have seen not only protests, but protests be translated to action. And organizations like Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives, along with traditional civil rights organizations, were able to galvanize, the heart and the minds of people who were out in the streets almost every day and every week, and take them to the polls, right? And really make a huge statement that, we are done with white supremacy and white nationalists in this country. And not just individuals, but that the systems that uphold those constructs need to be torn down, need to be eradicated from our society. And we can't wait to do that anymore. And so I think, we are at a turning point in this country. And what we do, not only in the next 4 years, or even I would say in the next 18 months, will really set the stage for what happens in the future in this nation, and how we're able to fully, sort of no longer tinker around the edges, but lead and really sort of bring forth transformative change, right? And I was listening to the earlier panel where the person was talking about, asking for what you want, being bold and being visionary in your requests, and not settling for the margins. And I think that's what we've seen. I think the impact of that movement has led people to say, no, no more. We are not going to accept sort of the crumbs that you are leaving for us and have left for us for so long. We actually want and deserve more. And we're going to hold you accountable and make sure that you give us more.
So well said. I really agree with that. And just the urgency, right, that is now here. I think it hasn't always been felt, but hopefully it's being felt now. So thank you so much, Sakir, for what you just shared. And that kind of takes me to my next question, which goes to Stephanie, who's here with us. I'm grateful to say you will have her audio. But Stephanie, discussions on policing surrounding police reform, they're often focused on the legislative piece of it, an incredible legislation like the BREATHE Act, for example, but how those laws get implemented are just as important. And I would love to hear your thoughts on how, or just really about your role, right, in the justice system, and how can other publicly funded attorneys join in that fight against police brutality?
Thank you. So first, I have to say that, I am an elected Commonwealth attorney in the state of Virginia. That's my title. But before I'm a prosecutor, a Commonwealth attorney, I'm a Black woman. And I'm a mother of 4 Black children and a wife of a Black and Latino husband. And, I bring all of that with me to the work that I do. I'm never able to separate the trauma that my community has felt for as long as this system has been in existence. And so every day I grapple and struggle with being a part of a system that, quite frankly, has oppressed, that has been what it has been in place for, that has been the impact of it. And every day I do all the work that I can to undo those harms and to start restorative justice models going forward. And I say that to say, everybody who is in the position of DA, elected state's attorney, or anything of that nature, whether they're Black, brown, whatever they are, if they are not struggling, if they are not, realizing the detriment and the disservice that mass incarceration does, they're not right for us. They're not right for our country at this point, where we realize that we truly must decarcerate, that we must pull the resources from incarceration and invest them into community. And so when you talk about the BREATHE Act and the movement for Black Lives, which represent the voices of so many in our country who have done the work of realizing what we need to do in order to move away from the system of oppression and this racist system, it is my job to fight in any and every way possible to impact transformative change. And so for me, that has looked like lobbying with the General Assembly, that has looked like testifying before Congress at times, and that has even looked like in 2015, prosecuting a police officer in my city who killed an 18-year-old unarmed African-American young man, William Chapman II. And when I say, I prosecuted him, I don't mean my office did it, I mean I did it. I was first chair on that case. And led the trial, through a week-long jury trial, a year of pretrial motions, and ended up with a voluntary manslaughter conviction. And so I say that to say, this summer I saw a lot of hopelessness around our country. I saw people saying we can never get convictions, we can never get justice, but I know that's not true. If you have a fighter, a publicly funded fighter, meaning you serve the public, meaning you are not a Commonwealth attorney or a state's attorney to sit up on a pedestal, or to just be in power, you are there to serve the public. If you have a true public servant who will fight in any and every way, we can see the results that we need in order to hold the police accountable, hold ourselves accountable as law enforcement, as elected officials, as public servants, and, to do our best to see that transformative change. I'm done with talk about moving a needle. Incremental change is a failure. We cannot embrace or accept that because our lives depend on it. And so that is my simple answer, is that we must have elected leaders who are struggling with seeing the impact that, this system has had on communities of color and Black people. And I get asked that question all the time. Oh, as a Black woman prosecutor, how do you feel? I feel a struggle, an internal struggle every day, but that question should not be reserved for me and those who look like me. If you are here to do it the right way, we should all feel the internal struggle pushing us to try to work ourselves out of a job. Ideally, I would like to work myself out of the need to have a prosecutor. If we are truly investing in our communities and putting the resources in places to end food insecurity, to have adequate housing, to invest in education for our young people, to create opportunities for thriving in industry, and to build intergenerational wealth for our families, and to end this cycle of destruction that is mass incarceration. Then we will see a society in which we are not depending on the criminal legal system to address problems in a way that it never, ever, ever successfully addresses them. So I'm glad to and thankful to be a part of this conversation. But if you don't hear anything else from me, please hear that we can do this. We can see change, and we can fight this fight. We just have to be willing to do so.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Wow, there's so many amazing truths that you just dropped in that. One, the idea of bringing your full self into every space that you inhabit. I don't think we can highlight the importance of that enough. I think it often gets minimized, and also that idea, like what it means to be a public servant. Like, what does it mean? Everyone is sort of expected, right, to rise to the occasion and fulfill that duty when they take on that role, regardless of what they look like. And so I thank you for your work and for your thorough response. And, based on what Stephanie just said, Hassan, that leads me to you and to your work. A lot of times conversations around policing in the US often centered around natural born citizens of the United States. But we kind of miss the fact that policing really has a lot of harmful impact on immigrant communities as well. Can you talk to us perhaps about some of that harm and why it's so important for us to include immigrant communities into this conversation?
Absolutely. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me onto this panel. I hope to be able to offer a modicum of help and assistance and knowledge and empowerment by talking about the effect that a lot of these policing or policies have on immigrant and aspiring American communities. The original sin here is a marriage that never should have taken place, and that is the marriage between the criminal and the immigration system. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about who actually engineered, this marriage and how it actually happened. We often talk about the system in an abstract sense. And part of my advocacy is uncovering who's actually behind it, like naming names and organizations and funders and people that have actually been working on this on these sort of policies for decades. I want to start out by just saying and noting that systems that intend to preserve and enhance the grip of white supremacy this goes back to the founding of our country, but nobody here listening should presume for a minute that the same organizations that are trying to hold police unaccountable, allowing police to act beyond the law, responsible for the system of mass incarceration, have not engineered a system for immigrant communities as well. It absolutely exists. When someone overstays a visa, overstays their status in the United States, it's not a crime, okay? Entering the United States without inspection is a crime on the books. It's a misdemeanor, on par with, here in Virginia, on par with driving without a license, or perhaps a reckless driving ticket. That's the level of crime that we're talking about here. But the consequences of doing so mean potential permanent banishment from an entire life that has been built by the aspiring American inside the United States. The congressman talked before about proportionality of punishment and how misguided the policies in the 1980s were about being tough on crime, 3 strikes, you're out, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we're talking about here minor crimes to non-existent crimes, things that are not even considered crimes under our criminal code, that are being prosecuted and punished as if they were criminal. But we hide behind terms like civil detention. We hide behind terms like family detention, when in fact, it is the meting out of criminal punishment without the corresponding constitutional safeguards. All right. You talk about an agency like ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who routinely terrorize immigrant communities and aspiring American communities to the point where even crime victims, victims of domestic violence, are afraid to call the police on a chance that they're going to be reported and deported for their reporting. Okay, this is not a system that is sustainable. It's not a system that will provide even a modicum of hope to aspiring American communities. And if you really want to see where the patriarchy will take this system, you can look at the immigration system, because this is where you can see the meting out of criminal punishment without corresponding safeguards. Let's take a look at these two systems here, criminal and immigration. In the criminal justice system, there's a right to a speedy trial, there's a right to a jury, there's a right to confront one's accuser, there's a right to counsel, right? In deportation proceedings, none of those protections apply. People can be held on civil detention for months, if not years. There is no right to counsel. You can get your own lawyer, but one will not be provided for you. These cases can drag on for years and leave entire families, in limbo. And I guess the fundamental point here is that there still is technically, at least under the law, a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. In removal proceedings or deportation proceedings, you're out of here unless you can show essentially beyond a reasonable doubt that you have a reason to stay. So what do you have when you have these two vastly different bodies of law coming together and married to one another? You get a giant mess. And if you want to be able to see where they'll actually take this system, look at the criminal justice, look at the immigration detention complex signed into law largely by President Clinton in 1996 with the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, which laid the groundwork for the entire deportation machine that has been honed, oiled, and operated by every president ever since. So it absolutely is a police accountability issue. It absolutely is a criminal justice issue. It absolutely is a racial justice issue, because immigrant communities are obviously largely Black and brown bodies. And I said before, and I'm going to try to wrap up with this because I've probably gone over time, and I apologize for that. But the system itself of how to engineer the laws to result in the apprehension, detention, and expulsion of as many Black and brown bodies as possible. I lay the blame at a number of groups: the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA, all founded and nurtured by a white nationalist named John Tanton. These are groups which currently, or at least in the past administration, held considerable power and sway over immigration discourse. They were the ones behind SB 1070 in Arizona 10 years ago. They were the ones behind IRA in 1996. They have sued the Census Bureau in nearly every decennial census since 1980 to get that citizenship question put on. They were founded by a guy who took money, who believed in 1993 and actually wrote to a colleague that in order for the United States to maintain its national identity, it must remain a Euro-American majority, and a vast one at that. He thought Latinos were uneducable. He was a believer in eugenics. For those of you that might not be familiar, it's the race pseudoscience or pseudoscience, junk science that tries to prove that white people are genetically superior to members of other races. And took money from groups that actually modeled family planning programs on, get this, the Nazi government of Germany. So when I call these people Nazis, I'm not saying it lightly. I've got documentation to prove it. I'll stop there, but the reason why this absolutely is a racial immigration and the needs and requirements of the aspiring American community has to be included in this, because the patriarchy included them in their sights and married the criminal and immigration systems together when they never should have been brought together in the first place. So
Wow.
I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much, Hassan, for just those facts are just very sobering. They're very, very sobering. But thank you for laying it out and making those connections, because I don't think we always see them, right? I think, and perhaps by design, right, that we don't always see those connections between the two. You know, my final question is for everyone on the panel, and that question is just, you know, taking in mind that over the last 9 months, there have been so many different policy proposals and ideas that have been thrown out. And I think that we can all agree that a return to whatever normal was prior to the Trump administration it's not going to cut it. It's not enough, right? So for each of you, what would you say the next step should be? What policy, if you could implement one now, what would that be? And how can now and its members, how can they sort of join you in that fight? What should they be fighting for?
So I'll start. You know, I think one thing is to start to change the language we use. You know, people talk a lot about reforming this, reforming that, and reform oftentimes yields more of the same. And I think all of the panelists, myself, Stephanie, and Hassan, have all pointed to how we've been reforming for decades and we're still at the same point. And so we are actually, you know, working to present a vision of the future that is transformative, that is very different than what we have now, and that reorients our thinking around social problems in America. Because what we've done is, with the immigration system, with the criminal legal system, we have created structures of enforcement and oppression to continue, you know, sort of in the line of anti-Black racism and discrimination, to address, in many instances, what we believe are social problems, right? Or social breaks in the fabric of our country and breaks in the social contract that we have with individuals in this country. And that is true for everyone, no matter if you were born and raised in America or if you immigrated here, right? There is a social contract that has been broken, and has been broken especially with Black and Brown people for decades and for generations. And so in 2019, the Leadership Conference, along with 120 other organizations, put forth Vision for Justice at 2020 and beyond, a new paradigm for public safety. And the concept behind that policy platform was really to take a holistic approach to transforming the criminal legal system, looking at it through an intersectional lens, looking at it in a comprehensive way, and talking about the ways that it needed to be you know, sort of changed soup to nuts, you know, from the top down or the bottom up. And that platform not only puts forth a set of policy recommendations, but it also sort of has us rethink the ways that we approach safety in America. And that is at the core, and I think the heart of many of the issues that both Hassan was talking about and that Stephanie and I, you know, sort of work on and talk about, right? We have viewed safety for too long through the lens of the criminal legal system, through police, through incarceration, through, you know, sort of enforcement, and not talked about safety in a manner in which we know sort of works and has worked for many, many years in certain communities in America. There are certain communities that are quote unquote safe, that don't experience policing and enforcement in the same way. And much of that is due to the types of investments that they have for very, very long have been getting on a regular basis, whether that's investments in education, equitable education, economic opportunity, the infrastructure in that community, the healthcare system. All of these things play a part and are part and parcel of creating safe and thriving communities in America. And the criminal legal system has been the place that we've tried to achieve safety, and it hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked because we know it was only about keeping Black and brown bodies subjugated and oppressed in this country as an extension of chattel slavery in America. So for us, Vision for Justice is the way forward. It's the way for us to think through the policies and practices that need to be in place, but also how we change and shift resources away from investments in criminalization and policing towards investments in every other aspect of American life that we know keep people healthy and safe and thriving. So what I would suggest is every, sort of member organization to look at that platform, to see, adopt those policy principles, and then to work in coalition to see those things put into place. The platform is comprehensive. It not only talks about federal policy change, but also has a state and local section. And so those of you who are working at the state and local level, I think it's very critical to not only, sort of find the groups of people that are like-minded with you and to move for transformative change at the state and local level, but then also leverage that work to the federal, right? Each and every one of us, except for me, because I'm a DC resident and we don't have DC statehood. So DC statehood, but everyone else who lives in a state that has representation in Congress, right? That person is there to represent your interests, and they listen to their constituents. So if you are working on, let's say, police accountability at the local level, it is important for you to weigh in with your member in the House, or weigh in with your senator around your priorities there. If you're working on pretrial justice and trying to decrease jail populations in this country, which are overrun in many instances with people who have needs, who have mental health needs, who have social economic needs that are not being met, and they're using the jail system as a place to house them. You should be talking not only at the state and local level to your elected leaders there to transform those, but also to work on federal changes that also influence the state. And so for us, there are a number of issues. I don't think there's one single issue. We are working on police accountability, pretrial justice, transforming the pretrial justice system, sentencing reform, eliminating mandatory minimums, looking at conditions of confinement and rethinking how our prisons operate in America. Vastly different models for that in other countries that are more humane, more dignified, more equitable. And finally, removing barriers for people who have reintegrated, who are coming back home, right? Because everybody's coming out of prison someday, except for those who unfortunately are on death row. And even then, we should be abolishing the death penalty, right? And pushing for this administration to, for once and for all, abolish the death penalty. So those are some of the key issues that we're prioritizing over the next 2 to 5 years. And I would invite all of you all to join in that fight with us, and also to see us as a resource in the work that you're doing at the state and local level to bring about transformation in a lasting and meaningful way.
Thank you so much, Sakira. I think you raised such good points. Thank you for sharing that resource that people can look into. But also, you use the word investment, and I think that that's really key. I think when we're talking about safety, I'm just of the belief, right, that you invest in something that you value. And if you say that we value safety, then we need to invest in the things that actually help create safety. And you raised such an important bit about education and what those communities actually look like before the police show up, that would help create more safety. So thank you so much for raising that. I'm going to hear what Hassan and Stephanie have to say, but just so the audience knows, we are going to have a point to create room for conversation and to have your questions asked. So if you have a question that you would love to share with our panelists, please write it in the chat box, and we will do our very best to get to it. Know that we don't have a whole lot of time left to the panel, but we will try to get to as many questions as possible to really have a good balance and a good mix. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie and or Hassan, whoever wants to go first in answering the question.
Yeah, I will say, Sakira, she just stated it beautifully. This is so comprehensive. This is not simple, but it is nothing that we can afford to, wait around on, or again, accept that incremental change. It has to be transformative. And so all the pressure has to be applied to address the community investment going forward. But we also have to look at undoing the harms of the past. That's a very important conversation that has to be had about looking at the fact that Virginia, we don't have parole, and we don't have expungement. And so as we look at legalizing marijuana and creating an opportunity for industry, the very people who have been impacted by something that we're now saying should be legalized, they won't have that opportunity for industry. So once again, our community doesn't have the ability to build that intergenerational wealth and do things that other communities have been able to do. And so in short, I don't want to belabor the issue because again, Sakira gave a very well-rounded response that reflects a lot of the same things that I lobby for and work on, but we must look back and undo the harms of the past, look at our state legislative measures to create an opportunity for us to do so, and at the federal level. And things like even student loan debt, those are things that impact Black women in a way that they don't impact other communities. And these are the people who are, oftentimes holding down families, holding down people who are incarcerated. And there are generations who have been impacted by mass incarceration. We need to be looking at the police officers in the school system, what impact that is having on our children, our Black children who are being harmed, who are being abused. And oftentimes, if you think about living in public housing, you see police in your neighborhood, you see them in your school. And what are we doing? What message are we sending? Are we preparing our young people for higher education? Are we preparing them for incarceration? And so looking at these harms that have gone on in the past that continue on a day-to-day basis, if we're talking about what we can do moving forward and we leave out the conversation about how to stop what's happening now and undo the harms of the past, then we're missing something. So I just, again, I'm very thankful for this discussion. But I want to make sure that we should never say, well, all right, we're going to look forward. With this new administration, we're moving forward. No, we're not there. We must look back to, and we must, ensure that we're doing everything that we can to address all harms, the past, the present, and the future.
I really don't think there's much else that I need to say that's been spoken so well and eloquently by my co-panelists here. Very briefly, I think getting a little bit down into the nitty-gritty, it's important to understand who the powers are that be, the powers that are actually perpetrating this entire system and have been perpetrating the systems that have kept Black and brown people down and subjugated for a long time. It's time to expose them, whether they wear a white pointed hood or whether they wear a suit and tie and roam the halls of Congress. It is important to expose them and purge them so that we can actually create a space to talk about rebuilding our system in a fair and a just and in a compassionate manner. It's also time for us to unite amongst ourselves. And I'm just going to say it, even though it's an uncomfortable topic, but in our immigrant communities, we need to get rid of anti-Black racism. We just have to get rid of it. It's something that I have seen, unfortunately, not only amongst different immigrant groups, but against Black people. And as long as that continues to be the case, all of marginalized communities are going to be continued to relegated to fighting for the crumbs that are left over from the haves, and will forever be, the have-nots. It's an unfortunate system. It's an unfortunate fact that we're going to have to get over. This is a book that I refer to quite some time, if anybody can see it, The Presumed Alliance by Professor Nicolas Vaca, The Unspoken Conflict Between Latinos and Blacks and What It Means for America. Unpopular, uncomfortable book, right? But it is something that needs to be said, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. We have to prevent our diversity from descending into disorder. Only then will we realize the true benefit of the ideological and racial and cultural and religious and gender-based diversity that we have to build something greater than the sum of its parts. So I'll end with that, and happy to learn from the rest of you.
Oh, these are such good answers. Thank you. Thank you all so much for what you shared, whether it's from the investment to looking back and forward to kind of recognizing the importance of calling and exposing what's wrong that is existing within our communities and within the system before we can even change it. We can't change what we don't acknowledge, right? And I thank you all for highlighting those important facts. We do have some questions from the audience I'm going to share. For you, Jan Erickson asks the question, what are the chances of modifying qualified immunity at the federal level? Any thoughts on that?
So thank you for that question. As some of you may know, the House last year members in the House, Jerry Nadler, Representative Jerry Nadler, Representative Karen Bass, and led the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And that bill sort of took a stab at bringing about police accountability in a number of areas. One being eliminating qualified immunity, which is a doctrine that has allowed not only law enforcement, but public actors, actually, public sector employees to be shielded from any liability for violations of individuals' constitutional rights. In the bill, I said it takes a step because instead of eliminating qualified immunity, which is a judge-made doctrine, it's a judicial doctrine. There's no statute that gives them this shield from liability, but courts have done so. The bill only applies the sort of abolition of qualified immunity to law enforcement. So for many who have worked on this issue, Center for Constitutional Accountability, the ACLU, the fact that it is now enshrining into law a defense for other state actors to violations of constitutional of individuals' constitutional rights, there is a concern right there. So there is a push to expand that provision to ensure that it once and for all abolishes qualified immunity and not just in the context of law enforcement, which is an important step forward, but it could go further. And so I think there's an uphill battle with respect to that. I mean, the fact is that, members of Congress, it's an issue that many people don't understand, and there's a lot of education that needs to be done. So we're actually working on that. There will be a briefing on the issue in the coming months, and I'll make sure that you all get that information about the briefing to share with your networks. But we're hopeful that there might be ways around addressing the issue of civil liability for state actors who violate individuals' constitutional rights, and some bipartisan support for taking that approach. So that's what I can say about it now. Not amazing news, but that's the update for right now.
Yeah, it's where we are, right? Thank you for that, Zakira. I want to jump to the next question, and it kind of hinges on what you're saying about the lack of education around qualified immunity and what that all means. And Dee Darling was asking, how do we quiet the scare tactics that the police unions are spreading, that passing legislation for police reform makes us less safe? And I think they often pull qualified immunity and the removal of it into that argument, that doing anything to reform the system would undo the system in a way that's harmful to everyone. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely have thoughts on that. We can see very clearly that we are not safe, especially if you're Black. You're not safe, and you're not safe from the system. And so that argument about, public safety, our communities are not made safer by mass incarceration. They're not made safer by incarcerating people who have addiction issues and mental health related issues, and, incarcerating children in school for behavioral issues that should be dealt with in the school. And so none of this behavior is making us safer now. Let's be very clear. And, again, it is resulting in death for Black people. So we have to continue to push against this status quo narrative that if we move away from what's happening, we won't be safe. Well, newsflash, we're not safe now. Our country was founded on violence. There has been nothing done for the past 400 years to address that violence. And, the only thing that we can do now is speak truth to power, that the statistics are there, that are very clear about what mass incarceration does to families and communities. And we know that we have not had a government that has invested in Black communities. And so if you want to have true safety, community safety, the goal is to invest. And we don't need more policing for that. Police are not behavioral healthcare specialists. They are not equipped to deal with these issues. And moving resources away from police is not going to do anything but put those resources in community. We don't have unlimited resources. And what are we valuing? Are we saying that we value, police being in communities and stopping people and all these things that, once again, aren't resulting in us being safe? Or do we value human life? Do we want to make sure that people are fed, housed, educated, and cared for? because if we want community safety, that's what we have to do. We have to begin to invest in our people. So I get very frustrated when I hear we're not going to be safe. Well, we're not safe now. And I think that's what a lot of people have seen this summer. And with the rise in the ability to film, we see that body cams has not changed anything in terms of, the safety. It just puts everything on display. So that's a very dangerous argument for anyone to make, that removing resources from police or reducing the number of police in our schools or communities will keep us safe, because that is a part of the reason why we're not safe right now.
And if I can just
Go
add
ahead,
to,
Shakir.
if I can just add to what Stephanie said, I think the other point, it's a red herring to suggest that accountability leads to less safety, right? I mean, if you think about any other profession, the medical profession, the legal profession, there are standards. There are standards that we must adhere to. Stephanie could be, any lawyer could be disbarred for violating certain ethical standards. They have to carry insurance in order, if there is a malpractice case, right? The same is true for doctors, right? You have to have there are certain standards that they must adhere to. So the idea that public servants, people that we pay, our tax dollars pay for, right, should not be held to high standards, especially when they have the ability to take life, sometimes with impunity, in many cases with impunity, that they should not be held to high standards, that they should not be held accountable for actions that violate someone's constitutional rights, that they should not be held accountable for discrimination, that the system should be sort of transformed, and they should not be moved away from engaging in traffic stops, engaging in sort of calls for service around mental health, engaging in certain things that they are not trained, they are not equipped, they don't have the expertise to do, would lead to less safety. Is just, as Stephanie said, it's a fallacy. And the data does not improve that. In fact, it disproves that, right? We have had more police in this country since the passage of the 1994 crime bill than we've ever had before. And that hasn't yielded a level of safety that any of us would say is correct. What it has done is that we've increased our incarceration rates. The 94 crime bill exploded mass incarceration in this country and built on the preceding acts, right, that Congressman Bobby Scott talked about in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, with the advent of the war on drugs and all of those policy changes. This is a history, right? This isn't just happen overnight. And for too long, we've said that police are the defenders of safety, when in fact that isn't true. Communities are. And they haven't yielded safety. And police show up to crime. They don't actually prevent it. They show up after you call and the harm has already been committed in many instances. So we have to really rethink and retrain our minds around this issue to think about, what's true and what isn't true.
Absolutely. And I think that goes, thank you, Stephanie, also for your thoughts. I think you both really highlighted this idea of, when we think about safety, it's like safety for who and safety from what, right? Because I think even just to your point, Secure, about education, like when we talk about safety, some people are feeling safe, and if it's working for them, then it may not matter how it impacts other communities. And I think when we're going to have an honest conversation, we have to be honest about who needs to feel safe and what exactly do they need to feel safe from. And if we find out that it's white people need to feel safe from people of color, from immigrant communities, well, then the system works exactly as it should, doesn't it? Right. And so we sort of think about that language. And I love your substitution of the word qualified immunity for accountability, because that is exactly what it is. And I think most people at a gut level understand accountability. Qualified immunity sounds like a legal term that you don't need to understand or pay attention to, and it gets lost very quickly. So thank you both for just highlighting the importance of that. The last question that we have, it's not the last question we have. The last question we can get to with the time that we have is from Becca Fink. And she talks about being in Berkeley, and she says that her police chief there made a comment that monitoring white supremacy activity on social media is just something that they can't legally do. And they felt that that's something that should be done. Otherwise, it assumes that brutality against people of color is somewhat legal when you kind of use that framework that the chief seems to be using. So Becca wants to know, what suggestions can they take here in sort of addressing this in Berkeley and with their police chief? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I'll just briefly say, I will look at the patterns of the behavior and the conduct of that department. If they have surveilled quote unquote gangs or other community organizations in the past, as we know many police departments do, then that argument obviously is a fake one. So I would go and look at the history of what that department has done. Most departments do surveil, and there are even departments that have gang units. Like, here locally, there's a gang unit. And that's what they do. They look at social media and see what people are doing. And so I would, ask for, hopefully that is publicly available information. But if you run into a snag with the freedom of information, you might have a clue to the fact that, yes, they actually are surveilling people. And that was just an answer that they gave you to shut you up, just being straightforward. Once again, as Sakira said, it's about accountability. And if they're, I know in California, there are a lot of prosecutors who have committed to holding law enforcement accountable. So maybe you can speak to the prosecutor in that jurisdiction and see if they have information about the previous conduct and whether or not there's an opportunity to look into that type of behavior. They have the authority to criminally charge if there is misconduct, and that qualified, I just put it in the chat, but that qualified immunity discussion does not stop prosecutors from holding police and law enforcement criminally accountable. And so if you find that there has been a misinformation, surveillance of one group and not of another, if you are in one of those jurisdictions with a prosecutor who has committed to transformation and police accountability, please go to your prosecutor and see if they can help you. And that is a part of holding them accountable to, keep to the word that they gave to the people when they said, we're going to do things a different way. I came around in 2015 before the quote unquote progressive prosecutor movement. And, I have seen a lot of people use it to say the things that sound really good. But now we are in a time where we absolutely need to see action, and we are to hold ourselves accountable as prosecutors, and the people are to hold us accountable to our word to ensure that we are seeing this transformative change.
And I'll just add really quickly, I know we're running low on time. That's not a can't, that's a won't in response to that question. I mean, it's just the way I see it. I'll give a brief example here in Virginia, in Culpeper County. I worked with a group called Muslim Advocates to file a FOIA against the police, with the police department in Culpeper County, Virginia, who had invited a notorious Islamophobe, a guy who goes around spreading conspiracy theories about how all Muslims are terrorists, et cetera, and was actually brought in and paid. They used taxpayer funds to pay this guy to come and train police officers in Culpeper County on understanding the threat of from international Islamic terrorism in this little county in Virginia. We FOIA'd it and we got a whole bunch of documents, and literally we had this guy coming in and radicalizing the police officers by selling them onto this fiction of a civilizational jihad against between the West and the Muslim world. Okay. Taxpayer money was being used to actually train these police officers to do this. So you never know what you're going to find if you get a good organization behind you and start utilizing FOIA offensively. Start utilizing the Freedom of Information Act strategically in places around the country. And again, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I've said it before, expose them and purge them.
What a rich panel, you all. Thank you so much just for the practicality of your answers, but also just the depth. It's just, I could talk to you forever. So thank you all for all that you've shared. And I just thank all of you who've been participants in this and listening to this conversation. I really hope that you take the incredible advice and resources that have been shared by this panel and you use them. That's what we're fighting for. We're fighting to not just talk to each other, but then to do what we can with the information that we have in the spaces that we inhabit to bring about the change that's needed. So learn more about what's happening right there in your own community, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I think Sakira, Hassan, and Stephanie have all highlighted your right to ask questions and to be informed about what is happening with your money and in your name. So thank you everyone who came today. We are going to take a brief break, about 10 minutes or so, just to regroup and get ready for our next panel, which will be discussing hidden bias in technology. So thank you again to our incredible panel, and I'm going to hand it back over to our now hosts.